Good afternoon. Thank you, NIUA, for inviting me to speak this afternoon. I was asked essentially to talk about innovation in the context of urban wash. And before I start, I'm going to divide what I'm going to what I'm going to say is divided into two parts. The first half is going to be to just set the context of what we're up against, and then to look at some of the areas where I see the need for innovation in the context of urban wash. So we start off with essentially, we're still faced with a problem of access to water, particularly for the urban poor. And I think it's important to recognize that in urban areas, particularly if you have the misfortune of living in a non-notified slum, there still is a huge challenge of access to water. That doesn't mean that those in notified slums have access to water, but the fact is that access to water, particularly for the urban poor, is a huge area of concern. There are questions around quality of drinking water and about the safety of the water that's available. Sustainability of the source. It's important to recognize that there's a huge dependence on groundwater to meet the drinking water requirements in our urban areas. Delhi, for example, is, I think out of a bulk of Delhi's districts actually are critical in terms of groundwater availability. So in some sense, very clearly, our extraction of groundwater far exceeds our ability to recharge. So the source itself is not sustainable. We also have problems around inadequate conservation of rainwater. We have ignored, not just in Delhi, but across the country in all our towns and cities, we've ignored our lakes, tanks and ponds, and the role that these water bodies have played traditionally in ensuring water security of our urban environments. Within sanitation, we have issues around access to individual toilets, particularly for the urban poor. They have constraints of space. There are challenges around technology and design. We have the problem around community and public toilets, and in particular, challenges around operation and maintenance of these public facilities. Fecal sludge management, management of grey water, the recycling, reuse of water, sewage treatment plants, decentralized fecal sludge management solutions. Our cities are still grappling with questions of whether they should go in for sewered networks or whether the future is going to be in non-sewered solutions. It's important to recognize the challenges that sanitation workers face. India continues to witness deaths of sanitation workers every week somewhere in the country. And so it's important to look at questions around safety and health of sanitation workers and what can be done in some sense to make life safer for them. And the last three are questions around institutions. In the previous session, there was some reference to urban local bodies. It's important to look at what's the situation with regard to our institutions, adequacy of trained personnel, the skills that they have, the plans and the institutional structure that exists. And last two issues that we're faced with are questions around finance and around policies. Just with this sort of rough background to some of what we're up against, I'm going to now try and focus on 5 areas for innovation that I think that we should be looking at. And these are not necessarily in order of priority. I think the first is to look at the institutions that we have. By and large, we have not looked at investments in our urban local bodies and in our structures for governance in urban areas. And there is tremendous scope for innovations around urban governance. I think it's important to look at questions around citizen interface. How do we get citizens to engage with their urban local bodies, with the governance structures in their cities? And what's the innovation that is possible, either through use of technology or otherwise, to enable this citizen interface to take place? There is a need to look at the design of our utilities, of some of our structures for providing water sanitation services in some sense. And I think it's time for us, it's quite likely that in the near future, at some point of time, government's going to start to look at the finances of urban local bodies, and is going to be surprised that a bulk of our urban local bodies are actually in the red. Unfortunately, when we've tried to reform, the next option is to then move towards PPP, as if public-private partnerships are sort of the solution to all our problems around with institutional failure. So in some sense, we need to reimagine what our utilities are going to look like and what's the structure that we require for meeting the challenges around WASH. The second broad area where we need innovations is around policies. Policies around, for example, if you were to look at, we talked about community toilets earlier. The fact is that one of the reasons why community toilets continue to suffer across the country is because of poor operation and maintenance. How do we look at subsidies? How do we look at ensuring that the government is able to provide service providers who are managing some of these facilities, whether it's community toilets or public toilets, with some amount of subsidies to ensure that the burden is not felt by the user or the poor in particular? These subsidies could be either to individuals or to the service provider. We have to look at questions around pricing and the pricing of services. Water is a great example where, in some sense, water is very poorly priced in our country. If you were to look at the cost of water and the provision of water in Bangalore, for example, the actual cost that is transferred or recovered from consumers is 10% what it costs the municipality to actually procure water at. So in some sense, if you're actually subsidizing 90% of that water, and a bulk of that water is used by the middle class or the rich, then in some sense, is that the best ways of use of capital? Can we expect conservation to take place or people to judiciously manage the resources if we don't get pricing right? The third issue within the policy framework is around regulations and standards. Standards to do with service standards and regulation to do with everything from desludging operations, tipping off desludging trucks into sewage treatment plants. Where do they dispose of the waste? What happens to the sludge from treatment plants? How is that safely disposed? So in some sense, there is a lot of work that needs to be done around looking at the regulatory framework for managing some of this in an urban context. The fourth within the policy framework is around multiplicity of institutions. To give you an example, if you were to try and set up a decentralized fecal sludge treatment plant in a city like Delhi, you will need to get, independent of your permission from the municipal corporation, you need to get clearances from the pollution board, from the groundwater board, the irrigation department, the fire department, and the public works department. So in some sense, when you have multiplicity of institutions, it becomes very difficult for innovation to take place or for people to come forth with solutions in a city context. We need to look at procurement. One of the reasons why a lot of the innovation that exists, particularly around technology, finds use in government at a very late stage is because of the old L1 process around bidding. And I think if we want to encourage innovation to take place, we have to find a way to fix the procurement process in government. We have to also look at how to invest if you want to try out new technologies. Essentially what is happening today is new technologies emerge. Private service providers are the first to adopt these technologies, and government is very often the last to try out these technologies. Can that be flipped over? Can government take some more risk and try out some of these technologies in the WASH context? We need to look at contracts, because if you look at private service providers providing services in an urban context, one of their biggest fears is around payments and their ability to get payments in time. Can we look at more robust contract systems, enforceability of those contracts, and payment systems that make it easier for private service providers to also provide services in an urban context? The third area for innovation is around financing. If you were to look at there's an estimate that if we were to try and ensure pipe water supply for all rural and urban households by 2030, there's an estimate that is likely to cost us $115 billion US. So which means that in the next 12 years, we would need $115 billion US to try and ensure pipe water supply to every household in a rural and urban area. Where's that money going to come from? There's a study done by Richard Damania, who's an economist of the World Bank, and he says that actually if you were to look at cumulative global debt of all governments, the cumulative global debt of all governments put together is $63 trillion. But if you were to look at the surplus available with the private sector, that's $100 trillion. So in some sense, you have governments which are hugely indebted, and you have huge surpluses of capital sitting with the private sector. Is there a way we can start to look at new financing models where we're able to find the resources required for the investments that need to be made in the infrastructure? The fourth area where there's a need for innovation is around data for decision making and to make informed choices. And this data is essential not just to monitor service standards. So take, for example, the ambition to provide 135 liters per capita per day in an urban environment. Now, while the ambition is to provide 135 liters per capita per day, if you were to start to look at what proportion of our urban population actually has access to meters, you will find that a very small proportion of our urban population actually has access to meters. How then do you even measure what is the amount of water that you're providing if there's no way of measuring it? If you don't have adequate meters, how can you even start to measure what's the level of service that you're providing? And so there's a need for us to look at ways of ensuring that there are smart meters, we're able to measure what services are being provided. There's a need to be able, in the earlier session there was a lot of mention of the importance of behavioral change. One of the challenges that we're facing is that usage is a very difficult area to try and measure. And there's a need, and surveys very often now are proving to be very, very inadequate in measuring behavioral change and in measuring usage. So what is the innovation that is possible to try and be able to measure usage, for example, of toilets, or to measure the impact of behavioral change investments that are made? There's a need to map, in the urban context, water bodies, aquifers, to start to understand where our groundwater is, where recharge is possible. The last area is on technology, and I chose to mention technology last because very often when we think of innovation, we think of technology. And within technology, if I were to prioritize based on what we see as the challenge, I would like to mention 6 areas where I think there's a great need for innovation and we don't see enough of that happening. The first is around water quality. It's ironical that today you can actually use an app or you can use your phone and you can call someone and you can get a full blood test done with the samples collected at home and your report is sent to you by email at the end of the day. I'd like one of you, if you're living in Delhi, to go out and try and get your water quality tested. And it's very difficult to go and find a reliable lab that's willing to test your water quality. So in some sense, in terms of pathology, we've seemed to have found enormous improvements in terms of being able to test blood, urine, stools, all of that, but we can't get water quality tested in our urban environment. So in some sense, if people have to make rational choices about what purification systems to use, for example, how do they find out what technology is most appropriate for them if they don't know what's the quality of water that's being provided? Now, if you were to listen to Delhi Jal Board will tell you that the quality of water that they provide in most areas in Delhi is actually potable and you don't need any purification system to do it. But there is a trust deficit. And the simplest way to solve this would be to make water quality accessible for people so that they can test their water and then decide whether they just simply want to drink that water or they want to install an RO system which is going to reject 50% of that water, which will go down our sewer systems, will have to be treated all over again. The second area where there's a need for innovations in an urban context is around rainwater harvesting. On my way here, I was passing large numbers of government buildings. And I was struck by the fact that in a city like Delhi, where you have such large amount of accommodation available, government accommodation available, how little of that water is actually rainwater is harvested. Today, we are in some sense, if the poor are facing the brunt of poor access to water, you also have citizens who are willing to take steps for conservation, who are willing to invest in rainwater harvesting. But for them to be able to decide on what's the size of structure that they're going to need to get, where do they get their pipes from, what filtration mechanisms exist, it's very difficult for someone to even start to plan for rainwater harvesting because a lot of that information is not easily accessible. So in some sense, if we want middle-class consumers, the rich, to also take actions around conservation, maybe we should try and look at ways or innovation to try and make information about rainwater harvesting much more accessible. The third area where there's a need for innovation is around the treatment of both grey water and black water. Our cities and our municipalities are faced with a tough choice. When they look at developed societies, they find that a bulk of developed societies and cities in developed countries have sewer systems. And aspirationally, they would like to believe that sewer systems are necessarily superior and better in the long run than any other option that exists. But very often, given the quantum of investment that is required to put these sewer systems in place, municipalities now are starting to look at decentralized solutions for either treatment of grey water or black water or both. But the fact is actually recycled and reused. And the last two areas where I think there's a need for innovation in an urban wash context are around recharge of groundwater, a septic tank or a sewer line. Those full body suits were never designed for a subtropical climate. Full body suits were designed for a temperate climate Today, the risk is that if a sanitation worker were to wear a full body suit and enter a sewer line, they will die just simply because of the heat. So we're not able to even look at protective equipment that is suitable for our ecology and our temperature. Today, if you were to speak to sanitation workers and ask them about, before they enter either a septic tank or they were to open a manhole cover and decide to enter it, how do they decide whether it's safe or not? And you'll be horrified that the way that they check whether it's safe to enter or not is that they will lift the manhole cover, and if they find that there are cockroaches around the surface or on the rim, it's possibly safe for them to enter. Now, at a time where we talk about apps for everything under the sun, how difficult would it be to find sensors that could tell you whether, even before opening a manhole cover, whether it's safe for someone to go inside or not? So in some sense, again, if you were to look at desludging, there is a need essentially to look at sanitation workers, because the need for sanitation workers is not going to end. And so in some sense, there is a need for innovation to make life of sanitation workers safer for them to operate. So to summarize, I think that if you were to look at innovations in the wash space, we need to look at them not just in the context of technology, but across institutions, financing, policies, and data for decision making. Thank you.